Hello, English learners. Welcome back to another informative and engaging episode of our podcast. My name is Jennifer.
And I am Elizabeth. Today, we have an exciting conversation lined up for you, focusing on a topic that will help improve your English skills and broaden your understanding.
That is right. We're going to dive into a topic that is not only useful, but also essential for anyone learning English as a second language.
Exactly, Jennifer. We will be discussing practical tips and engaging scenarios that can help you feel more confident in using English in real-life situations. Whether you are talking to colleagues, friends, or even strangers, this episode will give you the tools to communicate more effectively.
Now, today's topic is quite interesting and thought-provoking. We will be talking about whether it is appropriate for governments to limit their citizens' freedom of speech. This is an important issue that affects many people around the world, and it is a subject of ongoing debate.
Yes, freedom of speech is a fundamental right in many countries, but there are also instances where governments choose to place certain limits on what people can or cannot say. So, Jennifer, let us start by defining what we mean by freedom of speech.
Absolutely. Freedom of speech is the right to express one's opinions, ideas, and beliefs without fear of government retaliation or censorship. It is considered a cornerstone of democracy because it allows individuals to participate freely in public discourse, to criticize the government, and to contribute to debates on important issues.
That is a very good point, Jennifer. In many democratic societies, freedom of speech is seen as essential for maintaining a healthy and open society. However, even in these societies, there are limits. For example, certain types of speech, such as hate speech or speech that incites violence, may be restricted.
That is true. Some argue that these restrictions are necessary to protect individuals and society as a whole, while others believe that any limitation on speech is a threat to freedom. It is definitely a complex issue, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Let us start by exploring some of the reasons why a government might limit freedom of speech. One of the most common reasons is national security. If a government feels that certain speech poses a threat to the safety of its citizens or the stability of the nation, they might restrict it.
Yes, for example, during times of war or conflict, many governments impose restrictions on speech to prevent the spread of information that could be used by enemies or to maintain public order. These restrictions may include censoring media reports or limiting what people can say in public forums.
That makes sense. But at the same time, some people argue that these types of restrictions can be dangerous because they can be used to silence dissent and prevent people from criticizing the government. In such cases, the line between protecting national security and suppressing free speech can become blurred.
Exactly. Another common reason for limiting speech is to prevent harm to individuals. For instance, many countries have laws that prohibit speech that incites violence or promotes hatred against certain groups of people. These laws are designed to protect individuals from discrimination and violence.
That is an important point. Hate speech laws, for example, are intended to prevent people from using speech to promote violence or discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or other characteristics. But these laws can be controversial because some people feel that they can also be used to limit legitimate debate or unpopular opinions.
That is true. It is a delicate balance. On the one hand, you want to protect individuals from harm, but on the other hand, you do not want to create a situation where people are afraid to speak out for fear of being punished.
Another aspect we need to consider is cultural differences. In some countries, freedom of speech is seen as an absolute right, while in others, there are more limitations based on cultural norms or values. For example, in some societies, speech that insults religious beliefs may be heavily restricted, while in others, such speech is protected under freedom of expression.
That is a really good point, Elizabeth. Cultural differences play a big role in how freedom of speech is viewed. In some countries, offending religious or cultural values can be seen as harmful to society as a whole, so governments may impose restrictions to maintain harmony.
Right. And while these restrictions may be seen as necessary in certain societies, They can also lead to debates about whether people should have the right to challenge or criticize cultural or religious norms.
So, Elizabeth, do you think that governments should ever limit freedom of speech? Or do you believe that speech should be completely free, no matter the consequences?
That is a tough question, Jennifer. I believe that there are situations where it might be necessary for governments to limit speech, especially if it is directly harmful, like inciting violence or promoting hate. But at the same time, I think these limits should be applied very carefully to avoid abuse of power.
I agree. I think most people would agree that there are some forms of speech that are harmful and should be limited, but the challenge is finding the right balance. You do not want to create a society where people are afraid to speak their minds, but you also do not want to allow speech that causes real harm to others.
That is exactly right. It is a matter of balancing the right to free expression with the need to protect individuals and society.
And of course, different countries and governments approach this issue in different ways. In some countries, there are very few restrictions on speech, while in others, there are many.
Yes, and it is interesting to look at the reasons behind these differences. In some cases, restrictions on speech are tied to historical events or political systems. For example, countries with a history of authoritarian rule may have more restrictions on speech, while those with a long tradition of democracy may have fewer.
That is a great point. History and politics play a huge role in shaping a country's approach to freedom of speech.
So far, we have looked at the reasons why governments might limit speech, but now let us take a look at some arguments in favor of complete freedom of speech. Some people believe that any form of restriction is a violation of basic human rights.
Yes, this is a powerful argument. People who support unrestricted free speech believe that individuals should be able to express their thoughts and opinions, no matter how controversial or unpopular those ideas may be. They argue that society benefits from open debate and discussion, and that even harmful or offensive speech can lead to important conversations about social issues.
That is true. There is the idea that in a free society, people should have the right to challenge the status quo, criticize their government, and voice opinions that might not be mainstream. This kind of open discourse is seen as a way to promote progress and social change.
Exactly. If we look back at history, many movements for social justice, such as civil rights or women's rights, started with people speaking out against the dominant beliefs of the time. Without freedom of speech, these movements might not have been possible.
That is a very strong point. Without the ability to express dissenting opinions, social change would be much harder to achieve. And proponents of free speech argue that in order for a society to remain open and democratic, people need to have the right to speak freely, even if their views are unpopular or offensive to some.
That is right. Another argument in favor of unrestricted speech is that allowing all kinds of speech, even harmful speech, helps to expose harmful ideas to public scrutiny. When ideas are out in the open, they can be debated and challenged, and people can make up their own minds about them.
Yes, some people argue that censorship can actually make harmful ideas more dangerous because it drives them underground. When speech is restricted, it can make certain ideas seem more appealing or powerful simply because they are forbidden. In contrast, when harmful ideas are allowed to be discussed openly, they can be discredited through debate.
That is a really interesting perspective, Elizabeth. Censorship might actually have the opposite effect of what is intended. Instead of preventing harm, it could make certain ideas more appealing because they are seen as forbidden.
Exactly. This brings us to the idea that it is better to confront harmful ideas head-on through open debate rather than trying to silence them. But of course, this approach has its own risks. There is always the possibility that harmful speech could spread and cause damage before it can be countered.
That is true. There is no perfect solution, is there? While unrestricted speech can promote openness and debate, it also has the potential to cause harm. On the other hand, restricting speech might protect individuals and society, but it could also limit important discussions and lead to abuses of power.
That is exactly the dilemma, Jennifer. It is about finding the balance between protecting society and ensuring that individuals have the right to express themselves freely. Different countries take different approaches to this issue, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. And this brings up another interesting aspect of the debate. Should the government be the one to decide what speech is allowed and what is not? Some people argue that governments are not always the best arbiters of what is harmful and what is not.
Yes, that is an important question. Governments, like any other institution, can be influenced by politics, and their decisions may not always be in the best interests of the people. In some cases, governments might limit speech not to protect society, but to protect themselves from criticism or dissent.
That is a very real concern. In countries with authoritarian governments, freedom of speech is often one of the first rights to be restricted. This can lead to a situation where people are afraid to speak out against the government and where important issues are not discussed openly.
Exactly. And that is why many advocates for free speech believe that government should have as little control as possible over what people are allowed to say. They argue that it is better for society to regulate itself through open debate and discussion, rather than relying on the government to decide what speech is acceptable.
That is a compelling argument. But at the same time, there are situations where most people would agree that some form of regulation is necessary. For example, speech that directly incites violence or causes harm to individuals should be limited, right?
Yes, I think most people would agree with that. Even in societies that value freedom of speech, there are generally some limits, particularly when it comes to protecting individuals from harm. Key question is where to draw the line.
Right, and that is where it gets tricky. How do you decide what constitutes harmful speech? Is it only speech that directly causes violence or harm, or should it also include speech that promotes discrimination or hatred?
That is a very difficult question. Some people believe that any speech that promotes hatred or discrimination should be limited, even if it does not directly lead to violence. Others believe that these kinds of ideas should be allowed, so that they can be countered through public debate.
And then there is the issue of context. For example, speech that might be considered harmless in one context could be considered dangerous or harmful in another. A joke made in private might be seen as offensive if made in public.
Yes, context is incredibly important when it comes to freedom of speech. What might be acceptable in one situation could be completely inappropriate in another, and that is something that governments as well as individuals need to consider when deciding how to handle speech.
So, Elizabeth, after considering all these different perspectives, where do you stand on the issue? Do you think government should limit freedom of speech, or should speech be completely unrestricted?
That is a very difficult question, Jennifer. I think there needs to be a balance. On the one hand, I do believe that there are situations where it is necessary to limit speech, particularly when it comes to protecting individuals from harm. But at the same time, I think these limits should be applied very carefully and only in extreme cases.
I completely agree with you. It is about finding the right balance between protecting society and ensuring that individuals have the freedom to express themselves. It is a challenging issue, and there is no easy answer.
Absolutely. And that is why it is so important to have open and honest discussions about these issues. By talking about freedom of speech and the potential limits on it, we can better understand the complexities involved and hopefully find solutions that protect both individuals and society as a whole.
Yes, I think that is a great takeaway from today's conversation. It is not about choosing one side or the other, but about recognizing the importance of both freedom and protection in a society.
Exactly. And as we have discussed today, there are many different perspectives on this issue, and it is important to consider all of them.
Well, that is all for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating discussion on freedom of speech.
We hope you found this conversation both informative and thought-provoking.
And as always, keep practicing your English, keep engaging with new ideas, and we will see you in the next episode.
Goodbye, everyone.